Hey there, my name is Alex or Mont, and this is my review of Bloodborne. First up, there will be no real spoilers during this video. The gameplay is all from an early Chalice Dungeon, and as such, no spoilers there. As all impressions and reviews, this video will contain my opinions on Bloodborne, and while some may pertain to hold more objective truth than others, they are still my opinions. For example, if I don't like the setting of Bloodborne, that is for the most part a subjective complaint. On the other hand, a complaint about, say, the long loading times is less subjective. On that note, this review is of Bloodborne played on the 1.02 patch, prior to the patch that improved loading times by anywhere from 5 to 15 seconds. I played through the game in New Game and New Game Plus and cleared almost all of the Chalice Dungeons, enough to fight all of the bosses in the game, pretty much. And I've platinumed the game, trophy-wise, in all around 100 hours playtime, let's say, so far. Those are the weird stats out of the way then, and the game doesn't need much of an introduction. It's an action-adventure game with RPG elements, with many similarities to Dark Souls and Demon's Souls. As is the usual for me, I'm going to start with the negative, the aspects of Bloodborne that I either did not enjoy, or feel can be improved upon. And don't get me wrong, I enjoyed Bloodborne a lot, and I think it's a great game. That said, I do have a number of issues with the game, such as the load times. Best to get the most obvious one out of the way, considering that one must needs teleport to the Hunter's Dream, this game's central hub, every time one wishes to level up or teleport to another area. That was over a minute of staring at a load screen on average. Loading the Hunter's Dream doesn't take too long, but loading back into the play areas of the game can take anywhere from 30 seconds upwards of 50, sometimes even a minute. Along with this, the game has several optimization issues. Why is this such a problem? Largely because every time you die, you were forced to sit through one of these load screens, which can be rather annoying if you keep falling to your death, for example, thanks to jump mechanic. But again, my impressions of the game in this review are before the patch that vastly improved loading times. They're still not great, but they have been vastly improved. My next complaint is that the game, for all its steps forwards, feels stuck or even regressive in other forms. Example, running, jumping and evading are all mapped to the same button, so if one tries to run then evade, you might end up jumping. If one is trying to jump, one might end up rolling, etc. It's quite a small complaint, but one that is easily fixed, and indeed has been fixed, in Dark Souls 2. Even if the games went through simultaneous development by different teams, there is no reason one cannot borrow from the other, especially when Bloodborne released almost a year after Dark Souls 2. And there are other areas that Dark Souls 2 introduced improvements that Bloodborne also lacks. These can be largely chalked up to different design philosophies, I suppose, such as New Game Plus being identical to New Game, whereas in Dark Souls 2, New Game Plus introduced a number of changes. That leads nicely into my next issue with Bloodborne, as it happens. The Covenants and the online system in general. Remember how I said the game sometimes feels stuck? This is largely what I meant. Dark Souls had an interesting, but very kind of bare-bones Covenant system, which Dark Souls 2 strived to improve, and I think in some areas it did improve. And in Bloodborne, Covenants kind of make an appearance, but in such a pointless manner that it makes me wonder why they bothered to include it at all. There's no real depth to them, they don't really add much, if anything, to the game in my opinion. The online play in general does not seem to have progressed much since Demon's Souls, which had a revolutionary system at the time. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Might be the case here, but in my opinion they have broken it, because the invasions and co-op in Bloodborne are not nearly as enjoyable or frequent as in other games, in my opinion. And it's not for a lack of players. First up, the co-op. The mechanic behind it is flawed in my opinion. Instead of spending a resource to summon other players, we spend a resource to begin a ritual that can summon other players, but might not. This is also a somewhat finite resource as far as I'm aware, and it's a resource that, well, we'll get into that later. But if you have trouble getting summoned by others, then quite often you might spend some insight and then not end up being able to summon anyone anyway. But this is rather nitpicky. My next complaint? Far from it. The PvP, or invasions in Bloodborne, are horrible. Now don't get me wrong, I've run into my fair share of rage-inducing invaders in the Souls games, but I haven't experienced a single enjoyable PvP moment in Bloodborne. Why? Primarily, I think, because invaders can heal. Now, if you take Dark Souls and let the invaders heal, that's an issue, but not so great an issue considering that you can punish them with the old backstab. Punishing a heal in Bloodborne is incredibly difficult, in part thanks due to latency, but mostly because, due to the extremely fast-paced nature of the game, well, compared to Dark Souls at any rate, blood vial healing is so fast. There is a very short window during that animation during which you can be staggered and set up for a visceral attack, this game's version of ripostes. But even if you manage to land a shot, and good luck managing that, there is very little to stop your opponent just standing up and immediately healing again, because whilst healing is limited, you can heal like 20 to 24 times, and you only have like 20 to 24 attempts at stunning someone out of that, unless you start making blood bullets. So to give you a quick rundown of how all but one of my invasions has gone down. I would get invaded, I would wait for them to approach me, I would reduce the invader to a low percentage of health, at which point they would run away and heal, or run away to hide behind some enemies and heal, leaving me essentially unable to punish them, then repeat until he runs out of blood vials. The one exception to this is when an invader killed me after spending maybe 5 or 6 blood vials and me none, because I didn't want to waste them on such a tedious affair, and that's what Bloodborne's PvP is to me, in a word, tedious. Now it's kind of like back in Demon Souls where you could just like munch grass all day, and even grass wasn't as fast as blood vials as far as I'm aware, and even then you can backstab them whilst they're chewing on the grass. You can't really do that in Bloodborne. Or certainly, there is an item that allows you to prevent people from healing, but you can only buy it after you complete a very late game optional secret area. Well, okay, it's not very late, maybe halfway through the game, a bit more. And if you get hit by numbing mist, you have nobody to blame but yourself. The throwing animation is incredibly slow to the point that you can strafe away from it, not even bother dodging. All of this, I feel, stems from the fact that invaders and summons have reduced health and can heal. Invaders will also generally only show up when you already have a summon with you, which means that ganks are frequent and nobody has a good time. I don't enjoy like ganging up on an invader. I can't exactly tell my summon most of the time, oh stand back, we're gonna have an honourable duel, and the invader probably just gets ganked, or you know, I don't know who's having a good time with this, but it's certainly not me, and I really enjoyed the PvP in all the other games. I feel a partial fix to this would be allowing invaders to retain their full health bar, but lose access to blood vials. Instead, maybe give them an item from the Covenant that allows them to heal using Quicksilver bullets, but it has a considerable startup animation, making it something you can punish. Think something along the lines of heal miracles in Dark Souls 2. They work, but you're vulnerable during the process. So imagine if you have an item, working somewhat like the Arcane Phantasm. When you use that item, it puts you in an animation, takes maybe 1, 2, however many your bullets you want for balance reasons, and it heals you. But during that, you can be staggered by a gunshot, or they can run behind you and do a charge-up attack. I think that would really improve Bloodborne's PvP, but that's just me. Of course, many of these problems cease to be if you're taking part in structured PvP, such as fight clubs wherein you can establish rules to better shape the experience. For example, no blood vials, only 5 blood vials, because, you know, some builds do rely on blood vials, blah blah blah. But yeah, during fight clubs, not so much of an issue. During the organic PvP experience, I hate it. Next up, I take issue with certain bosses in Bloodborne. I feel many of the bosses have ugly, grotesque designs that are simply too grotesque for my tastes. Thinking back to the Gaping Dragon from Dark Souls. It was disgusting, but so too was it enigmatic, and in a way, it's a pitiful, sad creature. Whilst there are certainly some in Bloodborne that give me that kind of vibe, I feel a lot of the bosses have no soul to them. Incidentally, I feel this is also partially because the enemies quite literally have no souls. In Dark Souls we would discover a little about our vanquished foes by exploring their souls, but there's nothing like that here. Oh, don't get me wrong, there are some amazing bosses in Bloodborne too, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but there are 2 bosses in particular that I feel are poorly designed, and for similar reasons in fact. Both are large bosses with lots of fur or hair that ripples. Very mild spoilers here, they are named Amelia and Parl, just so you know who I'm talking about if you've played the game. Whilst Amelia is rather fascinating when speaking of the overall experience, the way she screams in what could well be fear of us and flails in frenzied desperation, I mean, from like a lore and story perspective, she's a really cool boss, but from a gameplay perspective, she's aggravating. Whilst her long fur is animated nicely, it agitates the problem that her large size establishes, meaning that much of the time your screen's going to be full of her body or her fur, and you're not really looking at the boss, you're looking at her fur. Parl has the same issue. And both bosses have several hitbox problems. Not least of all, you can pass through the damage state of some of their attacks, and yet still be physically moved. For example, let's say Parl is swiping at you with one of his arms. You roll through the attack and you don't take any damage, but the arm itself physically catches you and moves you back into position in front of Parl. That's a problem, and it's inconsistent because most of the time you can literally roll through an enemy's weapon. You can't do that sometimes, and mostly with Parl, and it sucks. And that does actually lead into my next point, the game's difficulty. Whilst for the most part I take little issue with it, I think Amelia's difficulty spike is a little ridiculous. The area she resides in is deceptively easy and simple, and then you're pitted against a boss that has a health bar that you'll be lucky to dent if you're like on your first playthrough. It just didn't flow well in my opinion, and it's largely an isolated experience too, as I feel most of the other bosses mesh well with the difficulty of their respective area. I have one more issue with the difficulty too. If you wish to fight a certain boss who is optional, but nonetheless extremely important, you will be forced to slog through a number of Chalice Dungeons, including one which cuts your health in half. I hated that, because to me, that is the very definition of artificial difficulty, which itself a complaint that is often raised for these games, and usually, in my opinion, falsely. But outright cutting your health in half, and then pitting you against bosses who will probably one-shot you, if you make a tiny mistake or get clipped by their sometimes wonky hitboxes, that's not fun, and not in the spirit of the series in my opinion. The difficulty in the Souls games has come, from my experience, not from requiring manual dexterity or reactions from the player, but observation. Bloodborne continues in this trend. One great example, there's a level early in the game where, if you are taking the time to look around, you can spot an ambush that is really obvious when you see it, but if you're not looking, you're going to get killed by it probably, and the blood stains around that area suggest that a lot of players aren't being observant and they do die to it. But if you're prepared for it, if you take the time and you look and you observe, voila, no ambush. And then there's cutting your health in half. See the difference between those two examples? I hope you do, because it really kills it for me. Speaking of Chalice Dungeons, I don't really like them. The idea of randomly generated dungeons sounds great for replay value, doesn't it? But the reality isn't quite as good, for me. There is hardly any variety in the Chalice Dungeons, and once you've seen a few rooms and a few layouts, you've seen them all. It's like, oh, this is this room again, I know I can go through there, da da da. It's also quite hard to get co-op in these dungeons, and I think the process has been improved by the recent patch, but even so, you're forced to resummon like every few minutes, and it's a pain. I played all the way to a certain boss and I didn't enjoy like any of it. I was just doing it because I wanted to have footage of that boss. And the boss itself was great, but getting to the boss and everything on that way was blah. The concept though, I feel, is sound. Maybe it's something to work on in a future title and improve. Maybe make us set our own Chalice Dungeons. Part of the fun in Bloodborne, part of the fun in Dark Souls, Demon Souls, is the really good level layout, and when you're just going through the same kind of areas, but maybe room B is behind room C instead of in front of room A, I don't like it. I hope all this negativity isn't getting you down. We're almost done though. Just a few more issues I have with the game, including the crafting system. Weapons can be upgraded in a linear fashion as usual. You can make your sword go from +1 to +10 and enjoy a flat increase in damage. Now, replacing the prefix paths such as Fire Sword or Poison Sword, however, you have gems. I don't like the gem system. For the most part, your first playthrough will be spent comparing a gem that gives you 0.1% more damage with a gem that gives you 0.2% more damage, and I don't like that. It's the same problem that Borderlands and World of Warcraft once had. Why bother giving us like a bunch of talents if all they do is make your bullets do 1% more damage or do 0.5% more penetration? That's boring. There are gems that have interesting effects, there are, but by and large they're locked away at the end of the game or in really high level Chalice Dungeons. Sorry, not high level, low depth, whatever. The idea of the gems is a good one, I just don't like how they implemented it, because for the most part, it doesn't really change the way you play, it doesn't change how you use the weapons, it just goes, oh, this gem gives me plus 1% more damage, that's super exciting, only it's not. Watching numbers increase by tiny amounts isn't what I want from this type of game. I don't think anyone wants that from this type of game. It's not meant to be a really number crunching kind of game, it's an action RPG, emphasis on action. But perhaps the worst problem I had with Bloodborne is entirely a personal one that almost killed my motivation to continue playing. After a certain point in the story, the game will drastically change and begin teleporting you about a number of times before just dumping you at the ending. And I hated that. How many times are you teleported in Dark Souls? Considering you can travel from Firelink Shrine to Ash Lake without a single loading time screen. And when teleporting to Anor Londo, you can see it above you, you know where you are going. But in Bloodborne, the last third of the game, maybe the last half of the game, features a lot of teleporting between random locations, somewhat akin to the Painted World, only you don't see a painting of where you're going. These locations are isolated from the rest of the world, and I know why they did it, don't get me wrong, and I won't go into that because of spoilers, but I still hate it. One of the things I enjoy most about these games, I enjoy seeing where I've come from and knowing where I'm heading. When you take that away, when you start lifting me up, throwing me across the world to a completely random place, it kills a lot of the sense of adventure for me, and you know, it's an adventure game. When you kind of lessen the sense of adventure, not my kind of, you know, I'm not going to enjoy it. My final complaint with Bloodborne, which is by far the most subjective of them all, I just don't like the setting and story all that much. The game is thematically very dark and obtuse. While there's nothing wrong with that, it's a bit too dark for me. I can appreciate what Bloodborne is doing, but the setting and themes just don't appeal to me all that much. The story is dark and there aren't many NPCs to encounter during your adventure. In fact, most of the characters in Bloodborne are kind of just talking doors. Those who aren't don't do much. They have their own quests, like in other games, but they're unusually short here for some reason, and they don't feature enough development for my tastes. Which is a shame, as I really enjoyed the characters themselves. I just, you know, I kind of want to see more of them. And then there's the issue with the villains of the game, and it's very hard not to spoil things when going into this, but with Dark Souls, we know about Gwyn. With Dark Souls 2, we know about Vendrick. With Demon Souls, we know about King Allant. We can understand their motivations and their goals and their purposes. The big bads in Bloodborne, they don't really have clear motivations because by their very nature, these enemies are not meant to be understood. They are beyond our comprehension and understanding, which from like a narrative standpoint, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you're in a video game and you are directly opposed to them, I feel that that is an issue. Like, why am I meant to be fighting these guys when I don't really understand them, and I cannot understand them? Again, it's not necessarily a problem, it's just something I don't really like, personally. But that about does it for all my complaints, so let's move on to the positive stuff. And I have to start with the environments and level design, because damn, the sheer amount of detail that has gone into crafting Yharnam is mind-blowing. Yes, you will find ugly textures here and there, or some other visual anomaly, but that doesn't diminish the fact that this game's environments are breathtaking. The atmosphere is thick, oppressive and engrossing. Every single aspect feels like a masterpiece of artistry. There's a lot of video games, and a lot of video games with cities in. Has there ever been one like this? And how long will it take before something comes close to matching Yharnam? It doesn't feel like a video game level, it feels like a real city. Yharnam is immense and full of life even though all right-minded citizens are hiding. Barrels, coffins, benches, all sorts of details are densely packed in that really do make the city feel authentic and lived in. But you know what's amazing beyond that, in spite of that, because of that? The level design. Even though the city feels like more than some video game map, it is designed with such intrinsic detail that just when you think you need a shortcut, you'll find one. The item that you saw half an hour ago. How good does it feel when you finally reach that area after exploring in the hopes of acquiring a new weapon or armor set? It feels damn good. The level design is just amazing for almost all of the game. Though there are some areas where I don't like the level design, like the stupid woods. Beyond that though, almost every area is just what you would expect from these games, and it's taken the level design from Demon Souls and Dark Souls, of what do they call it, Metroidvania or whatever, where you constantly looping back around and finding a shortcut and all that stuff. It's just amazing. It's a level beyond, and you know, I love that, and I really hope they keep it up. Now, without going much into spoiler territory, you will venture outside of the city. As I, said, there's a forest, which I don't really like. Most of these areas hold up too. There is a forest that I didn't care for, but there is in particular a small lakeside village by the name of Hemwick, which I adored. The atmosphere of that area is by far my favourite. The entire segment feels like it was lifted straight from a dark fairy tale, with witches and demented villagers and locals, all in an idyllic setting. Beyond that, there's dungeons, woods, caves, even a castle to explore. I remember some people were worried that the entire game would be stuck in the city. That isn't the case at all. There is enough map variety, I think, even if you do spend lots of your time in the city. Whilst the Chalice Dungeons aren't quite as good, they really do feel like classic fantasy dungeons in that they are dark, full of traps, monsters and treasure. And even at the end of the game when you get teleported around, it's not the areas themselves that I have any problem with. Oh no, they're lovely, they're awesome. It's just the fact that you get teleported to these areas that I don't like. So how about general gameplay? Love it. Rolling has been replaced by a much cooler dodge, although I tell a lie. Rolling's still in, save for when you are locked onto an enemy, which makes it feel, in my opinion, like more of a, oh no, let's roll through this trap or away from this thing, than a combat roll, which is, well, to be honest, it's quite stupid. Like, if you're fighting someone, you're not really going to start rolling around, because they're probably just going to kick you. But hitboxes are for the most part great, with a few isolated situations of hitbox shockwave shenanigans. The new parry system is incredibly satisfying. Even if it felt really weird at first, I soon got used to it. And now, there are less weapons than any other Souls game, a lot less. But each weapon feels a lot more unique now, whilst in Demons and Dark Souls, and especially Dark Souls 2, weapons only had combo strings of 2 attacks for the most part. They now chain much higher, like 5, 6 attacks maybe. Combine that with strong variations of every attack, transform or switch attacks, and like rolling strong attacks, dashing strong attacks, weak attacks. You have a great combat system that feels very satisfying, and it feels like a nice evolution of, the old Dark Souls thing. I just wish other aspects like the online had evolved as well. The weapons aren't really all that well balanced at the moment, I think, but this is a FromSoft game, so saying they aren't all that well balanced just means some of them aren't quite as effective as others. But for the most part, every weapon has its strengths and weaknesses and is entirely viable. You can play through the whole game with a starting weapon, and in some cases, you are, encouraged to do so because they're so damn good. And you know what? Even if the balance isn't perfect, that's what patches are for. They can patch it and make certain weapons stronger as they need to be. For example, I think the Kirk hammer needs to be buffed, because at the moment I think it's not good enough. Especially when you compare it to the Ludwig hammer. The Ludwig hammer, the Ludwig sword. I think that about covers it. To briefly mention the enemy and boss variety, whilst I do feel there aren't too many standout bosses or enemies, there is certainly a nice variety to them. And from my experience, the bosses at the start of the game are actually quite a lot harder than the bosses at the end of the game, which is kind of weird, but, well, whatever. You will always be looking forwards or dreading the next enemy type that you will encounter, and I think the enemies in this game are actually superior to the bosses. Like, I prefer fighting the standard enemies to the bosses, which is a bit weird, but, well, whatever. They are all suitably terrifying in their own way, but this is, well, it's not a Souls game, it's a Miyazaki game, which means the most horrible beast of all is generally the one you're controlling. I don't even know how I'd go about scoring Bloodborne, but the good outshines the bad, most certainly. It's a great game. Even if parts of it are not to my personal liking, I still appreciate the effort that has gone into its making. Would I like to see a sequel? Perhaps. I'd rather see them take the Souls games in a new direction though. Medieval fantasy, Victorian horror. What could be next, I wonder? I guess we'll have to wait and see, but I'm sure they won't disappoint. Wherever they choose to go next.